Welcome back to the Clinical Athlete Podcast. This is episode 5. Clinical Athlete is a network of healthcare providers who specialize in the management of athletes. You can find your nearest provider at clinicalathlete.com. And don't forget about the Clinical Athlete Forum, where clinicians, students, and coaches network, discuss, and share ideas and resources related to sports med, rehab, and performance. To join the forum or be listed on the Clinical Athlete directory, details and applications can be found at clinicalathlete.com. This podcast can be found on the Clinical Athlete website, YouTube, and iTunes. And specifically for iTunes, leave us a review if the show is helpful for you. We always appreciate that. My name is Quinn Hennick, and I am a doctor of physical therapy in Orange County, California. And I'm joined by Michael Ray, a doctor of chiropractic in Harrisonburg, Virginia. What's up, Mike?
How's it going, Quinn?
It's going well, man. How's Harrisonburg treating you?
Cold. Starting to actually turn into a little bit of fall.
You have seasons there.
We do.
Weird. I got away from that. I got the hell out of season land.
It's just like summer all the time for you guys, I think.
Yeah, you kind of get tired of it. Not. I'm also joined by Derek Miles, a doctor of PT in the San Francisco Bay Area. What's up, Derek?
Good morning, Quinn.
Good morning. Okay, upcoming Clinical Athlete events. Real quick rundown here. We've got 2 Clinical Athlete weightlifting certification courses coming up. One in Sherwood, Oregon, which is like southwest or like west of Portland. Gotta get my geography right. That's on November 4th. La Crosse, Wisconsin on November 18th. And then 2 upcoming Scientific Principles of Sports Rehab seminars, which Michael and Derek lead. And the first one is in November 18th, and that is in Seattle, Washington. And December 9th in Milpitas, California, which is next to San Jose, kind of that South Bay area. So today we are going to talk about youth athletic development. And in particular, we're going to talk about early sports specialization. So we've got 3 articles that we're going to run down, and I'm just going to list those articles real quick, and then we'll start jumping in and discussing the first one. They're all kind of research review articles, so you get a few smart people and you talk about a certain subject. So they're not necessarily studies, more of just like kind of discussing concepts here. So the first one is titled, "When is it too early for single sport specialization?" And the lead author on that is Brian Feeley. The second article is titled Sports Specialization Part 1. Does early sports specialization increase negative outcomes and reduce the opportunity for success in young athletes? And that's Gregory Myer is the lead author on that. And then Part 2 of that, I can't speak. Use your words, Quinn. Sports Specialization Part 2. It's early, Mike. Don't laugh at me. Alternative solutions to early sport specialization in youth athletes. And so part 1 was kind of, highlighting the issues, and then part 2 is potentially, discussing solutions. But we'll jump into this Feeley article. When is it too early for single sport specialization? And so the purpose of this review, as stated by the authors, is to summarize the evidence regarding early sport specialization and the risk for youth injury in a sport-specific manner, and to suggest areas where further research is needed to best assess the effects of single sport specialization. So they actually jump into a lot of stuff here, and there's some great stats. They just right off the bat, 27 million U.S. youths between the age of 6 and 18 participate in team sports, and 60 million participate in some form of organized athletics. And so, I guess that's a good thing. A ton of our youth, a good majority of them are doing something structured in regards to sport. However, sports specialization seems to be on the increase. So in 1997, 9% of children under the age of 7 participated in organized sporting activities compared to 12% in 2008. So I'm sure that is probably on the rise, 9 years later. And in this Feeley article on Table 1, I thought it was pretty interesting. They cite a lot of articles in various sports, swimming, tennis, and then review articles with multiple sports, where they show it seems to be that the elite athletes in that particular sport actually specialized later, spent less time in that one sport in their early years, but then were actually able to spend more hours on that particular sport as they got older. So again, you see this more kind of broad foundation from those that are elite. Now, is chicken or egg there, but it's just some interesting data there on table 1. And then we're gonna just define sports specialization by so they define sports specialization as considered intensive year-round training in a single sport to the exclusion of other sports. And in the 2 other articles we read, we'll put a caveat there to say greater than 8 months. So if you're training any one sport for more than 8 months of the year to the exclusion of other sports, that's defined as sport specialization. And so obviously it's like, how young is too young? But I'll start to throw it out to you guys and we can dissect this a little bit better. Mike, what do you think about this first article?
I thought it was a good article. Can you guys hear me?
Loud and clear.
Yep.
Okay, cool. I thought it was a good article. He kind of starts off by asking the question, like, why do youth specialize into sport? Why are we having early sports specialization? Why is that an issue? Which I thought was good. Basically what seems to be happening with early sports specialization is just the idea that you can get athletic scholarship to college, you could go on to pro sports and make a lot of money, but there seems to be a lot of pressure on kids these days, either by themselves, by parents, or by coaches, to specialize in sport early. And in fact, Feeley even goes on to say that specifically a coach is probably one of the biggest drivers for kids specializing these days. But I think they do a good job of going through, like, to actually silo out each individual sport and talk about various studies as it relates to that sport and kind of what they're seeing with injury occurrences. So they talk about, like, baseball with pitch counts, either within season or per game pitch counts, and how that correlates to things like shoulder pain or elbow pain. And they have several cited studies in here for a cohort of population. They talk about gymnastics and some issues with that, just because given with gymnastics, it tends to have specialization requirements earlier in adolescence for peak performance versus other sports. They talk about hockey. So I think it does a good job of just talking about each individual sport and then some associated studies with them. And it's kind of just a plethora of great citations. Yeah.
Derek, what jumped out at you in this Feeley paper in particular?
Well, I think it bears mentioning, it's been discussed in various components that a lot of non-contact injuries are training injuries. And I think this article does a really good job of pointing the light on this and it being more related to the sport you play than anything else. And if we're going to kind of broad frame out for a second, it goes away from, or actually it can kind of make a case for there needing to be just some standard foundational athletic prowess before turning into a baseball player, an ice hockey athlete, a gymnast. Because if you start specializing in there too early, you're going to start predisposing yourself or developing some of the tendencies you see that lead to injuries in each one of those sports, whether it be wrist injuries in gymnastics or shoulder and elbow injuries in baseball players. And I think it makes a good case for developing a wide array of athletic skill set instead of becoming a baseball player. And, logic alone says if you're going to be a baseball player, that's first predicated upon you being an athlete. But I think these days we have a lot more baseball players that aren't athletic than a lot more athletes that aren't baseball players.
Yeah, and we'll probably get into some more of the multifactorial nature of this whole thing in the first Myer article. But there's a lot of things that we can postulate as to why early sports specialization would then lead to a decrease. What it's looking like is a decrease in that actual sport as they get older. But like you said, maybe there's some adaptive changes that are just a bit too early for the athlete to be able to kind of deal with and recover from the workload. They mentioned in hockey, just the nature of the sport, kind of these kids that may not have the athletic prowess or have kind of developed, just general motor skill acquisition to run and jump and land and cut and fall and all these, and, roll and all these things are trying to just jam their bodies into very specific positions. Like hockey is kind of an awkward, you skate and you kind of like throw your hip into external rotation to push off, and then you throw it up into a deep hip flexion and internal rotation, and they're kind of postulating that perhaps that leads to some adaptive changes in the hip joint with these young kids at an early age. And again, you can say, well, maybe is it chicken or egg? Are they just kind of self-selected for that type of thing? But and then we'll talk about just the kind of psychosocial issue, getting into the Myer article specifically, that things just kind of stop being fun. I thought it was interesting, the pitch count. Both you and Mike mentioned that. So pitch count has been something that the youth programs seem to have been trying to employ for a while now, even as early, I think the idea came out in 2001, and then as early as 2006, really making that kind of a mainstream thing. But in this Feeley article, it said that one study, cross-sectional study of 754 pitchers, 9 to 18 years old, reported that 45% of the pitchers had no pitch count in place, and more than 13% pitched more than the recommended 8 months in a 1-year period. So it seems like, and then they also say, despite the recommendations put in place by the sport governing bodies, the rate of reported UCL injuries in youths has been on the rise exponentially. Whether this is due to pitch counts being adequate, not enforced, and not the cause to increase the diagnosis is hard to determine, but it doesn't seem like. And then below that, another study by Ahmed et al. Reported that 31% of baseball coaches, 28% of players, and 25% of parents do not believe that pitch count is a risk factor for elbow injury. So we're trying to put these things into place, but then there's this issue of buy-in from the not even the governing bodies, but the people who are so closest to the athlete, which are the parents and the coaches. A big chunk, a third, a quarter of them are just not even buying into the idea of pitch count, which makes it really tough. We're trying to enforce or trying to educate, and then people are kind of like turning the other cheek.
Well, if you look at what we have for pretty much all the research coming out of the long-term athletic development model, it really advocates for, in your adolescent, training to train, fundamentals, and just creating a big base out of it. But one of the other big takeaways is it really advocates for healthcare providers to be in the corner of the youth athletes and really advocating for them to make parents aware. And, we see this from the Ahmed study, 31% of baseball coaches do not believe the pitch count is a risk factor for elbow injury. I would argue that is a place where we can make a big difference as healthcare providers if we're aware of that. And some of it may just be unaware of the pitch count being there. Some of it may be volitional not using it. But it still comes down to, it's our job to ultimately protect the athlete and have their long-term best interest in mind. And I think too often we get too concerned with being the best 12-year-old, whatever type of athlete, not realizing that they don't pay 12-year-olds that often. And if you really want to make a career out of athletics, you need to be focusing on being the best athlete later on down the road. But that's a hard thing to understand, because if you have coaches right now, you need to be seen by this scout, or you need to be in 17 tournaments a year, that changes the focus. And I think you, Mike, and myself would come at it through the lens of weightlifting, because that's where we're the most comfortable. And I don't think any one of us would think going out and having a weightlifting competition every weekend would be a good idea, because at some point you have to take the time to get better and really adapt. But for some reason, the same logic is applied to baseball, soccer, whatever. And it's not only just a competition, it's an entire tournament where you're going out and playing 6-10 games over the course of a weekend. And you're so far above what that athlete is adapted to that it's no wonder that we see some of the breakdown along the way.
Well, how are you going to get better at your sport if you don't put in your 10,000 hours, Derek?
I'm amazed you put my name on the end of that and not Mike's.
Yeah, I was gonna throw that to Mike, actually.
Yeah. Mike, you want to go ahead and take this, since I can probably feel your blood pressure come up 4 points?
No, it wasn't too bad. Yeah, it's an interesting premise, like the thought process for a long time, I think, especially with specializing at anything is, the 10,000 hour rule. We've all heard it. Erickson was probably the most popular with his research in the 90s with it, looking at musicians and chess players and their ability to become elite level performers with amount of what we call deliberate practice. So the thought was, if you deliberately practice, which let me give you a good definition for that. Give me just a second.
I think that's in the Myer article, right? He defines deliberate practice.
Yeah, so there's been a couple definitions. Erickson originally defined it as the engaging in activities created specifically to improve performance in a domain, and then he later revised it to state that it could be inclusive of either practices that the team does or like coached by someone, or it could be solitary practice like what you do on your own. So there could be different types of practice that could be included in that 10,000 hours. And then basically it was saying, like, if you deliberately practice your endeavor, whatever it is, whether musician, chess player, or a sport, that you would likely become the elite level. And that was thought for a long time. Malcolm Gladwell actually wrote a book on this, and totally blanking on the name. I want to say it was like The Outlier, that popularized it even more so than Erickson for pop culture. But we did actually have a study come out that looked at this because we didn't have a lot of research on it for sports specifically. And so a study by McNamara came out in 2016, I want to say, called The Relationship Between Deliberate Practice and Performance in Sports. It was a meta-analysis. And basically he compiled a bunch of data on it and looked at, well, is there a correlation, a high correlation between deliberate practice and becoming an elite level performer at your sport? And looked at various sports. He also looked at, are there individual differences in the person that allow them to become a better performer at their sport of choice. And overall, what he found was there's only about an 18% explanation for deliberate practice correlated to improved performance. So we have this unexplained 82% of what else is involved that makes an athlete at the elite level. And there's a lot of like hypotheses of what that 82% exactly is, but 18% is pretty low. Like, we can't say deliberate practice doesn't have an effect on someone becoming elite level. It definitely does. I just don't think it's nearly as big of an influence as we originally thought. In fact, it's probably far, far much less.
Well, and also going back to the participants in the original studies where the 10,000 hour rule kind of came about, like you mentioned, chess players and musicians, there's not the physical toll coming from repeated cyclic bouts of training those modalities as there would be with sport. So to then just make the jump where there's really no evidence for, especially for youth, but to just to say, the 10,000 hour rule or for any physical skill, I think people don't realize that it was completely different populations that they were looking at for that data.
Well, I think it exposes our propensity for overly simplified explanations too, because 10,000 hour rule sounds really clean. If it was like the 9,432 hour rule, I doubt it would have stuck quite as nicely. And if you look at the original Erickson study, the part that I love that's always missed is one of the other big indicators wasn't 10,000 hours of deliberate practice. It was how much sleep the person was getting. And how often do you hear people like, oh, the athlete needs to sleep more as a result of it? There's nothing sexy about that. It's hard to sell. But if you really want to go ham on the Erickson study, then that athlete needs to be having 9 hours of sleep a night too.
I think it was also like, what was it, the 10,000 or 10 years, I think was like the other side of that coin. Yeah. But it's, that would be really simple. It would be like, oh, okay, we're going to start you at 5. We're going to accumulate up to 10 years of practice. So by 15 or 10,000 hours, you're going to be at elite level. But we know it just doesn't work that way. I mean, in fact, now we have enough evidence to say that it's unlikely that that's going to happen. I mean, we look at which Myer study was it, where they cite it's 0.2 to 0.5% of our youth athletes actually go on and be elite level performers.
I was even surprised it was that high.
Yeah, I thought that was somewhat high because that comes out to, like, if we go off of the 20 million or so estimate, that's like 20,000 in the U.S., which is still to me pretty damn high.
Well, I think that's a good point that shows how poor most of us are in thinking in terms of probability. Because if you really look at that, if you have a 0.5% chance or 0.2% chance, you really are a unicorn at that point, and you really need to look at this at instead of I'm better than everyone else is what's going to help me get better. And I think that's a central theme to a lot of this is accepting training as a process, and then the long-term athletic development model, training to train. The competition doesn't mean that much in your teenage years. It's only, well, in most sports, there are some caveats to that, gymnastics being the foremost. But it really isn't until you start getting a little older and developing into it that it actually has some rewards. And by that time, you've established such a base that you are able to express your athleticism and you're more durable. I mean, I think if you look at some sports, it actually is almost a trope of the person that was really good in high school and then, or I mean, let's face it, he peaked in high school is an actual entry into the American vernacular. And it's saying this person got too good too soon and offered nothing later in life. And, we accept that as being a risk, but it's that whole, it's not going to happen to me risk. But if you really look at it from, if we're going to really try and look at training someone, it really is just an investment in the long-term development. And, trying to have all this, I'm going to make you faster right now, I'm going to get you seen by 17 coaches. That's not about the athlete. That's about basically the person who's trying to do that being a dealer for the athlete, and the athlete's the commodity, not actually an independent actor in the situation.
Yeah, exactly. Hey, Mike, we can hear you flipping your papers all over the place.
Can you?
Yeah. Quiet down back there. Good Lord.
All right. My bad.
Yeah, that's all right. Derek, you mentioned gymnastics, and the Feeley article goes through a list of sports. They talk about gymnastics, ice hockey, baseball, swimming. But you worked with gymnasts in Florida, and I want to talk to you about that because the article does say that is a caveat and an exception with things gymnastics, also skating, figure skating, where they're starting, body size has something to do with it, and it seems to be at the elite level, you're actually like in that pre-pubescent stage to get really, really good at the sport-specific skill. So if that is the case, then are we kind of stuck in between a rock and a hard place if we know that it actually does improve, you actually will have a better chance of being in that elite level if you get good early, and then how do we combat that?
Well, and this is going to be all contingent upon the sport played, because it's easy to apply the greater than 8 months, and it's a heuristic with which to operate off of, but there's always going to be exceptions to it, and gymnastics being the major case for that. But if you also look, gymnastics tends to be a little bit of a self-selecting sport anyway. If you look at gymnasts as a whole, they tend to be a little bit higher on the Beighton scale, a little bit shorter in stature, and at some point when you start hitting puberty, you're going to see some athletes select themselves out of gymnastics as far as reaching the elite level. And it really becomes a true chicken or egg. Is it the sport that picks the athlete or the athlete that picks the sport? And if you're involved in this and you happen to have a huge propensity towards that athletic skill set, you're probably going to specialize in gymnastics earlier. Now, that doesn't change your risk of injury. It's just the peak in the sport is much earlier than in other areas. And so if you look at gymnastics as a whole, it's not like they have a much lower injury rate than anywhere else. It's just the nature of the injuries associated with their sport. And if you know what those injuries are, your wrist, your spondy, and we know some ways of attempting to combat that. I would argue if you're a gymnast, those foundational principles against reducing that risk could be an integral part of programming.
How would you reduce that? Just workload and education? I mean, if like with the women, with female gymnasts, it seems to be like you said, low back, wrists, Feeley mentioned for some of the male gymnasts, more so like shoulder and elbow type stuff. And so how are we reducing that risk?
Well, so if we look at a lot of it in its simplest form, You have some dedicated strength training programs. And I know we're trying to avoid going down that rabbit hole in this podcast entirely, but a lot of the research would say your major way of really being able to reduce the overall risk of injuries is by having a dedicated strength training program focused on some of the deficits inclusive of each sport. And that's the simple answer to that.
Yeah. And once I'm just kind of going down the list here of different sports like swimming, it's just the hours and the workload amaze me. So one study was cited that elite swimmers typically swim between 4 and 9 miles per day and often swim 11 months of the year, beginning at age 10 to 12.
Well, I think swimming is an excellent case of survivorship bias, to where you look at it
You
and
don't drown, right?
well, yeah, if you are the one that happened to survive all of the things that were thrown at you, then you really were the survival of the fittest in that, like in the most literal sense of that, and you're the one that made it through. But how many swimmers probably could have reached elite level, but were hampered by injuries along the way? And I think swimming as a whole tends to kind of fly in the face of a lot of training methodology where it's just more is more and more is better. And that's not what a lot of the research really says, especially in the youth athlete. And as we get into the Myers article, the second Myers article, we're going to mention burnout. And I think in swimming in particular, this is a real issue to where you have athletes that just can't handle that type of volume and they start getting psychologically burned out as well as any kind of physical or as much as any type of physical repercussions along the way.
Yeah. Mike, any other thoughts on this Feeley article?
I almost like looking through how they talked about each individual sport. And we mentioned pitch counts earlier and how we're trying to get that enforced and people educated about it. Would you guys say some of the responsibility falls on the governing bodies of these sports? Like, I don't know that swimming has like the allotted number of hours of swim practice or stroke count or anything like that in place that says you shouldn't be swimming 4 to 9 miles per day.
Yeah, I don't know. The issue is a lot of these governing bodies are private entities. And, you know, if you've got a profit margin and these, you know, some of these year-round sports, club sports, these types of things, there's bills to be paid and there's money to be made. It's tough. Yeah, I don't know. Derek, do you know if other than, you know, baseball, little leagues and these types of things trying to employ pitch counts, you know, if the governing bodies are trying to impart some of these rules?
I think I've seen some thrown out, but it still goes back to how are you going to enforce it? Because some coach somewhere is going to be well, we're going to do it different. And you almost, to go back to our weightlifting, you know, performance enhancing drugs are banned in a lot of sports. How much does that stop them from being used?
Right.
So you can put the guideline in place, but if it's not adhered to, congratulations, you're just blowing smoke.
Well, I know we have contact hours regulations for sports as well. So that's kind of like what my thought process was with it, is enforcing contact hour regulation seems to be pretty well upheld. So how would we enforce, in addition to that, these different types of like volume parameters?
Well, I think they kind of talk about that at the end of the Feeley article, is kind of figuring out what those parameters would be. I think we just need more prospective data to, you know, kind of find that threshold.
We need Tim Gavitt to come over and do acute on chronic workload ratios for this stuff.
For sure.
For volume of each, yeah.
Well, because in baseball, they said that, again, pitch counts were developed in 2001 when it became apparent that pitchers who threw more than 75 pitches in a game reported increased shoulder pain. So there's some data coming out with baseball. The thing with baseball is that's easier, at least in the game situations and in practice too. Like pitch count is a little bit more objective than, you know, I don't know, swimming. Like the hours get kind of blurry. The frequency is so high. You know, how do you count it? Do you count, you know, just when they're just kind of warming up and their practice strokes? It's just hard. It's harder to objectify maybe with some of these other sports, especially team sports.
Well, one of the articles, I forget which one, actually mentions that like us as clinicians should be considering not only just deliberate practice with teams or on your own or with a coach, but also considering like all organizations that the athlete participates in, whether it's seasonal based, if it's club based, whatever it is, that we should be talking to parents and the athlete about everything they're doing throughout the year.
I think you made a good point there that was unintentional, talking about all the organizational side of it. Like, I think some of it is just emphasizing, hey, kid, you need to get out and just play. You don't need to be part of this organization or this club team, or like, you don't need a team jersey to go out and do some type of sport with your friends. And sometimes it should be, hey, we're going to go try and play some sport we've never played before. Now, if you got the baseball players out playing ultimate frisbee every now and then, or just, combine any two. But it's not jersey intensive. I mean, shirts and skins worked perfect when we were growing up. And that's really, I think that has been lost out of it.
Well, it sounds like it's not, hey, kid, you need to do this. It's, hey, parent, or hey, coach, chill out.
Well, yeah. And I think that's really where it is. But going back to it, as soon as you monetize a coach to say, this is going to be your career developing 13-year-old athletes, are they really a coach, or are they more of a cattle herder looking for the prize steer? And I'm sure we're going to get some blowback for that comment, but I'll stick by it.
You get blowback.
Well,
I ain't got your back.
Yeah. We had nothing to do with it.
It's all me, guys. Internet, feel free.
Attack. Organize an attack.
But it really is almost like a stockyard mentality, though. It's like, how many athletes can I possibly get into my stable? And then we're going to do whatever intervention, and then we're going to try and show off our prize cattle to all the scouts coming around and hope that they survive through to when it's maturation. It's trading in futures.
Well, and then it's selling training methodology, I think. Like, oh, you need 5 different specialized coaches for this one athlete, for this one sport. And there's a lot of money to be made here, so I definitely get it.
And it's also just lack of education. Derek, you mentioned maybe in baseball, some of the coaches not implementing the pitch count, but maybe they just don't even know. I mean, I played baseball one season in 6th grade, and the coach, like, I love the guy. He was my best friend's father, and he knew about baseball, but he didn't know anything else about that. I mean, so I don't think a lot of the coaches, maybe, and especially in these little leagues, are just have no clue. So you can say, pitch count, but they don't understand the significance of this. It's not just about pitch count. It's just overall longevity of the athlete. There's a big picture.
I think we think in short term very often. That's a fault of ours. It's just human nature. You think what's immediately in front of you, not 10, 20 years down the road for the athlete that you're dealing with,
Right.
Myers actually referenced what Derek was talking about in his first article with doing organized sports versus just go have fun and play outside and don't worry about whether it's organized. And he cites a study. This is on page 69 of the first Myers article. It says, in a study of nearly 1,200 young athletes in a variety of sports, the ratio of weekly hours in organized sports to weekly hours in unorganized free play, what they call the sports training ratio, approached 2-to-1. Young athletes who exceeded a sports training ratio of 2-to-1 are more likely to suffer a serious overuse injury. So these data seem to indicate that unstructured free play may potentially have a protective effect from serious overuse injury.
Yeah. So they just need to, and then the Myers article as well. I like this article. It's very similar to the Feeley article, where the aim was to talk about the current evidence, outline the potential negative outcomes related to sport specialization, and then maybe guide some alternative strategies. One of which you mentioned is just, and Derek mentioned as well, is just unstructured free play. Fun, enjoyment can help to decrease or mitigate the risk of burnout. And in the Myers article as well, on table 1, they have degrees of specialization, which I thought was cool to break it down into some subsets where they, there's kind of 3 things that you're looking at, or 4, or 3, excuse me. So specialization was low specialization was categorized as 0 or 1 of the following: year-round training greater than 8 months of the year, chooses a single main sport and quits all sports to focus on one sport. So if a youth athlete is doing 0 or 1 of those things, or falls into 0 or 1 of those categories, their overall risk of injury was low. Their risk of serious overuse injury was low, and then it said their risk of acute injury was moderate. I don't know. We have to look at the data on that.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
It's just one of those things. It was probably significant enough to fall into the moderate category, but not really of clinical difference. And then a moderately specialized athlete was described as having 2 of the following: year-round training greater than 8 months, choosing a single main sport, and or quitting all sports to focus on that one sport. And that increased their risk of injury in general from low to moderate, increased their risk of serious overuse injury from low to moderate, and then again, kind of a head scratcher, their risk of acute injury is still generally low, but maybe that's when we start to have the conversation of this athlete is performing cyclical patterns, and so maybe we're starting to see more overuse type injuries instead of acute, catastrophic, because nothing is new for them other than maybe taking a baseball to the head or a helmet to the kneecap or, something like that. And then a highly specialized athlete was characterized as having all three. So your kid is highly specialized if they're training year round, greater than 8 months in a single sport, and they've quit all other sports, and their risk of injury was high in general. The risk of serious overuse injury was high. And then again, a risk of acute injury was low, and maybe the same type of deal. They're becoming better at their sport, so nothing is novel anymore. But now they're dealing with these cyclical injuries or adaptive injuries potentially.
Quick clarification, Quinn. I was quoting from the second Part 2 Myers article, just for clarification.
Got it.
Well, and I think if we're going to get into the Myers, it's good that there's some quantification of injury risk too. So he actually says those athletes who met the definition of highly specialized athletes had a 2.25 greater odds of sustaining a serious overuse injury than an unspecialized young athlete, even when accounting for hours per week of exposure and age. So, if you're talking doubling your risk, that should be something that sets off some flags. And if you go a little bit lower in the paper, what's funny about it is it says, well, not funny. What's obvious about it is patellofemoral pain was one of the most common diagnoses in the studies, inclusive of calculating those odds. To beat the dead horse a little bit, what do we know about one of the best ways to really treat patellofemoral pain? It's from a dedicated strengthening program. And this is getting outside the norm of just we're going to go have this structured practice all the time into we're going to go train. And if you look at it and we really extrapolate out to like later in life, we don't know that many 25-year-old baseball players. And if your identity as a teenager is primary baseball player and you don't have the opportunity to go play baseball anymore, then what do you go do? But if your primary identity is athlete, well, you can still be an athlete at 25 and you've accepted the process of training. So if we're really going to try and model this towards some long-term gains, yes, you can go be a baseball player, but you still need to have that athlete moniker first attached to you because baseball is eventually going to drop off. But if you understand training principles and you enjoy the training process, then you're more likely to go train. But if you see training as just the next step towards the next competition, and all of a sudden competition disappears, well, what do you do?
Right. And Meyer also, go ahead, Mike.
I was just going to say, or you're that athlete who gets an injury early on because you're overtraining or you're having an overuse injury, and then you drop out and then you don't become physically active for the rest of your life. You're just kind of couch potato, so to speak. I think that would be interesting to look at the correlation of that with like obesity and the rates that are occurring with that.
Yeah, I think Meyer actually touches on that, and have to look at the data specifically. But the athlete having burnout, and then that creates a resentment not only to that sport but to physical activity in general, and then that kind of affecting them later on in life. So yeah, for sure. And I also liked in the Myer article specifically, they talked about tennis, because Mike, you asked in the Feeley article, what are these parameters for each sport? We got to find these things out. But in the Myers, the first one, he says that with the Women's Tennis Association, WTA, they developed an age eligibility rule and some pretty good data on this. On a 10-year follow-up, it seemed to be effective in increasing career lengths by about 2 years, which is, sounds significant, and reducing premature sports dropout from 7 to 1% in young professional women's tennis players. And the component of this program was a phased-in approach, they call it, to the number of tournaments allowed, beginning no earlier than the age of 14, with annual age-related increases until 18. So that is consistent with what we saw in the Feeley article, where they show that those who make it to the elite level seem to actually practice their main sport less early on and then increase the specificity as they get older. I mean, that sounds about right. And it seems like that program that they employed there is following that same guideline, which I thought was pretty cool.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. I actually had that highlighted. I think that would be an organization to continue to follow to see what other data we get out of that. But other organizations could mimic what the WTA is doing. And I think I like the ramped up approach. Like, you build this wide base of foundation that's diversified, and then you kind of build out towards the tip of the pyramid as time goes on. You get more and more specific with your training.
And also, it seems, because to me the question is, are we dealing with, is it the cyclical, like we're just talking like injury here, structural, let's take out the psychosocial element there for a second, but is it like the cyclical motion of the sports, or is it simply the workload? Like, we know, we talk about tendinopathy and cyclical loading may be a mechanism, all these things, but that WTA program sounds like it's really just a workload management deal. And so if you're just managing workload, and it sounds like, I would imagine that they just maybe made up a parameter and just kind of well, let's try this, based on the data that we know of with tennis players and how long they train and when they start, and what percentages are still playing at 18, 19, 20 years old, and let's just make a program and see how these numbers play out, and they seem to play out pretty well. But it sounds like it's just workload management, and you're kind of killing several birds with one stone. If you're decreasing their overall work to a specific area, then you're hopefully mitigating burnout, because they're not just doing that thing all the time. And then you're also managing the cyclical loading. And then tennis, how do you objectify that? It's not going to be swing count or serve count. So maybe that's an easier way to go about it. Like, baseball's a pitch count, okay, but maybe in these other sports that are harder to objectify, we just look at overall training load and workload, and then, like Derek said, supplement with some type of resistance training program where the goal is not an end game. There's no cutoff of how strong you have to be, and then you won't get injured. But it's like the process. There's something that seems to be protective of the process of resistance training. And that.
So I still think just sports specialization, you're still giving them an out with that kind of reasoning, and I still think there needs to be way more diversity than there actually is. So think about it like this: how many 18-year-olds, when they go off to college, know what they want to do? Not that many. We're perfectly okay. What do you want to be when you grow up? Well, I have no idea. But at 13 years old, they think they're going to be pro baseball athletes. So 5 years later, they have no idea what they want to do academically with their life. But at pre-teen years, we expect them to already figure out what sport they want to do for the rest of their life. It doesn't make any sense.
So I guess go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, the question becomes, at what point should these kids be specializing?
Well, if you look in the evidence, it says you start really tapering in around 15, 16 if you're going to get into it. And Post has a couple articles looking at this, and they looked at an entire cohort of D1 athletes. And out of that school, freshman year, less than 20% of them were single sport athletes. And by the time senior year came around, about half of them were. And that flies directly in the face of the dogma of you need to be a specialized athlete at the age of 13.
Yeah.
In fact, all of the evidence flies in the face of you need to be a specialized athlete at 13. I would argue, if you don't have an idea of what you want to do with your life that doesn't involve being a professional athlete, you shouldn't be allowed to be specialized into a professional athlete at that point.
Yeah.
It's everybody wants to be Tom Brady, but everybody forgets that Robert Kraft cuts his paycheck. So maybe at some point you should start looking towards the dude who pays Tom Brady.
Yeah, but the kids they're not thinking about that. I mean, it really just,
No.
I agree with you that the diversification seems to be the best way to go, but it's just got to happen at the foundational structural level. There's got to be some adults in the process here that are governing this thing.
Yeah, I think it's got to start at parent and clinician and coach level. Like we've got to be doing a better job of educating. This is what we're seeing with overuse injuries in athletes and why we should be diversifying. And which Myers article was it? Was it the second one that does a really good job of like laying out recommendations based on the available evidence of like what our youth athletes should be doing, and he kind of goes through each point. But really, the onus is on us to get this information out there and start trying to change the way we're doing things with youth athletes.
Yeah, and then in Myers 1, he just kind of lists, what makes sports specialization a risk versus diversified sports experience, and they talk about just the skill, motor skill acquisition, just having a general repertoire of movement capacity seems to be a successful marker in a young athlete. But they cite another study in high school athletes that found that those who did not take at least one sports season off during the year, fall, winter, spring, or summer, were more likely to sustain an injury, independent of whether the athlete was characterized as a single or multi-sport athlete. So again, just it seems like workload there, overscheduling and competition. There's just some of these sports are year-round now, and it's so hard to find a break, and then that increases pressure. So if you're always playing games, when do you ever have a chance to actually get better at your sport? I mean, when do you ever have a chance to dial back? All right, these are the things that I'm weak at in my sport. I'm going to practice this for a period of time, or I'm going to bring
Unfortunately,
yeah.
It seems to be when you get injured. It's like, oh, you got injured. Let's work on everything that you probably should have been working on.
Yeah, I mean, how the hell do you actually get better as an athlete? Okay, I want to be faster. I want to have better cardiovascular endurance. I want to be stronger. I want to jump higher. At what point are you able to train those qualities if your season is all year round? Your fitness levels are actually you're going to get very, very efficient at like your tempo of play, but you're not going to be able to develop any qualities. And
I think if we look at sports across the board, like no one ever looks at athletes and they're like, man, he got so much better throughout the season. They're like, no, he's surviving the season.
Right.
And I think some of this gets to circle back to the free play thing. If you look at it, when you go into competition, at some point you have to concede that you're going to sacrifice your health some for a win. Whereas if you're in free play out with your friends, you're like, dude, I'm tired. I'm going to go home. Like, if you have finite timelines in quarters, halves, whatever, versus we're going to go out and screw around for 2 hours, like you can be a lot more self-limiting there. So I think it gives some onus on the kid or the youth athlete to figure out when it's time to stop versus, oh, we need to hit one more bucket of balls.
Well, and going into the psychological burnout part of it in this first Myers article, they talk about that. Yeah. Talent development research on young athletes demonstrates that professionalized adult-style practices, like what you just described, are likely not optimal for fostering talent development. Specifically, research has indicated that adolescents need to enjoy the activities of their domain. Shocking. Like they need to have fun. Kids need to have fun. And that intrinsic motivators are key to maintaining participation and goal achievement. So yelling at the kid and saying, "Do you want that scholarship? Hit this damn ball." That's not going to motivate them. Maybe their motivation at that point becomes like making you happy.
Right.
Or just getting you to shut up and get off their ass.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, I think it works both ways out of that. But all of this is obviously multifactorial, but it's funny because there are some common themes out of a lot of things we discuss. And if we're going to go into it, the whole good old locus of control, that internal locus of control should be on the athlete the whole time. Like they should feel they're in control of the situation, not some coach who's going to tell them 7,000 things are going on and they need to change them. And if they don't hit 10,000 hours, then they're never going to make it at the next level. Like the criteria or the heuristics with which to base our decision making off of are pretty cut and dry. Don't play more than 8 months of one sport a year. don't participate in more hours of activity or structured activity than you are years old. And then they also said no more than 16 hours of organized sport activity through the youth cycle out of it. Those are pretty simple things to keep track of. And it's the one more rep mentality. Okay, well, we just have this one more tournament and this scout's going to be there. So we need to make sure we get to that one. And then all of a sudden you're playing year round. And then you're in that cycle of, well, when are you actually going to get better and develop as an athlete?
It seems to set you up for some withdrawal too. They mentioned a lack of fun is a more frequent reason for withdrawal from a sport at earlier ages, so you might not even make it. Performance pressures seem to become more central to withdrawal as the athlete gets older. So if you're pressuring the kids early on, they may not necessarily get better at handling pressure as they get older. It might actually weigh on them more because now they're, if they were this good at early age, they've only got to get better and better and better and better. And so maybe they actually start internalizing that pressure a little bit more. And it's just kind of like, confounding on them. It's just, so you threw out some good stats there. So it seems to be no more than, structured activity, no more hours than you are old, and no more than 16 regardless. And then to summarize, it seems like specializing at the age of 12 or earlier there's just no evidence that that's going to improve or increase your ability to become elite, and may then increase your likelihood for some of these things that we talked about. 13 potentially maybe seems like the earliest. And again, it's sport. We're talking context here. Gymnastics, figure skating, these things might be a little different, but then in that 14, 15, 16 age range, maybe that's when we're really starting to hone in a little bit, because the kid is maybe more emotionally mature to handle something like that.
Yeah, and then I think we've mentioned this, but I would just add in, like, taking a season off. No matter if you're a multi-sport athlete or not, all of them should take a season off throughout the year. One sports season off.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. And that's easier said than done, but the common theme is that we've come up with multiple times is it's on us to really advocate for that. And
right.
We can keep saying it over and over again, but this really comes into us being able to sell it to athletes and parents as this being a necessary thing. And like with most things, it's hard to sell the boring, more efficacious way against well, we have this one more tournament and you need to be seen, and we really need you to help the team. And it's most times the boring, efficient way is not the sexy way. Like, they're
not the sellable way.
Yeah. So, but then this is why knowing a lot of these statistics are so handy, because it's that survivorship bias. Well, okay, you survived. You are the Tiger Woods who went and the whole way through and has been training since he was able to pick up a golf club. Well, for every one of those, there's 10,000 that now hate the game of golf and don't ever want to go out with their friends anymore. Yeah. And if you look at the evidence, so I'm going to butcher this dude's name, but Vayans looked at the 2004 Olympians and found that the mean age of sports initiation was 11 and a half years. So just starting sport at 11 and a half. I mean, most soccer camps have already been 4 years of travel ball by then. Yep. And it says, in addition, the onset of training was negatively correlated with the time differential before the athlete achieved competition in any international competition. So if that's the case, you're talking Olympians, you're talking the elite of the elite there. And they're not starting until 4 years after we're already having pick one sport conversations. The evidence does not hold up with you need to be starting this at 7. You need to be playing year-round sport at 10. Like, you're going to increase your likelihood of injury, and all of the evidence would say you are much less likely at going or at burning out earlier and not making to the elite level. And you really have to ask yourself, as a parent or even as an athlete in your teens, do you want to become that trope of I peaked in high school? Or do you want to have some type of long-term development along the way? And all of the evidence would say if you start picking that sport early, you start playing year round early, you're much more likely of being that trope. So, we'll get your varsity jacket that says "I burned out" for your patch.
Yeah. It almost seems like just take a pragmatic approach to playing sport, but then we get kind of convoluted with all of these ideas that our kid's going to grow up and be this greatest player of their sport. They're going to make a lot of money and they'll be set for life. But if we just would take a pragmatic approach to it, it'd probably be a lot less injuries that we're having to see as clinicians.
Yeah, moving on.
How many
go ahead. No, you, Derek, go.
No, I was going to say, how many athletes do you think we've missed that would have excelled in another sport?
A lot.
They had the chance to actually participate in it versus just picking one sport and sticking there the whole time. How many phenomenal lacrosse players would we have that instead are just mediocre cornerbacks in football? Or, how many great weightlifters would we have that were mediocre gymnasts?
I think it's interesting, to go down that road, because I know one of the articles cited that 40% of elite level athletes' parents were also elite level in their sport. So it would be interesting to see if we had you try out as a youth athlete 10 different sports, whichever one you picked would probably be, I would imagine, the one you had the most fun in, which if we know that's part of the process of you engaging in the sport for long term, maybe that would be the sport you excel at. I mean, it's difficult to say, or are you genetically predisposed to be better at one sport?
Yeah, no, I definitely think, we haven't really touched on the genetics side of it. And, 18% of it is deliberate practice or is correlated with that. But how much of it's correlated on being a 6'8", 275-pound athlete? I mean, chances are you're going pro in something. It's just the sport you want to pick.
Right.
Well, and that...
Yeah, I think genetics has a lot to do with it.
Yeah, and that dovetails into some of the stats in the second Myer article, where one study had nearly 30% of youth athletes were highly specialized from a sample of nearly 1,200 young athletes. So Myers 1 defined highly specialized as more than 8 months, one sport, no other sports. And in this 1,200 youth athlete sample, 30% were in this category. And then they say in any high school athlete, like you mentioned this earlier, Mike, I think 0.2 to 0.5% are going to go to make it to any professional level. So of those 1,200 youth athletes, 360 of them were already highly specialized. And then, according to that stat, of those highly specialized 360, only 7 to 18 of them are going to make it pro in anything. So what happens to the other 342 or 353 highly specialized athletes who didn't make it pro? So now they were highly specialized, and maybe now we're dealing with some of the psychological issues or physical issues that we've talked about before. Like, where do they go from there? So it kind of goes back to what you said, Derek. They specialized so early, but what if they would have been really good at something else and perhaps enjoyed it a little bit more?
I think it's interesting too, we keep qualifying as success of elite is that they made it to the elite level. We also have to ask how long were they at the elite level? And so if you're taking into your elite career a ton of injuries that you've been dealing with for a long period of time, how long are you going to be able to operate at the elite level if you don't have these good foundational principles in place first?
Well, that begs the question of, at what point as coaches are we really there to develop speed, power, whatever, and how much of that emphasis should just be on making the athlete as durable as humanly possible?
Right.
And I think that is a major component that's missing a lot of time. If you want a long career, you need to be a durable athlete. So, being the fastest one around is awesome, but if you're hurt all the time, then you're not a very efficacious athlete.
Which our bias would probably say we should be strength training you because we know that's going to be a protective mechanism for injuries down the road. So
yeah, we need to get a bias button to where every time we say strength training, we hit it and it makes some noise and streamers shoot off behind one of us.
Yeah.
Myers 2, I'm going to say Myers 2 just to note the second article, but they just have more data just of the same type of deal. One of the NCAA Division I schools did a study and found that their athletes, that 70% of them did not specialize in their sport until at least the age of 12. 88% had participated in more than one sport. Overall, the university athletes specialized at an older age compared with students at the same university who were not NCAA athletes. And so there's confounding factors there for sure. But I think, yeah, and that's Mike, where you say 40% had a parent who was an athlete, and so maybe, but we don't know if that's good or bad. If it was a parent who played lots of sports, maybe that's what they're pushing on their kid to just try everything. If it was a parent who got hurt, like they were going to go pro, maybe they were really, really good or thought they were really, really good, and then they got hurt, and maybe then that has a negative effect because now they're trying to push that kid into that sport, to live through them. Who knows, but this is kind of where Myers, we talk about like which sports, when to recommended stage of specialization. They have a table here, table 2, where the type of sport matters. So gymnastics, diving, figure skating, very highly skilled, body size may have a big factor here. And the recommended stage is, if you want to, I guess, try to make it to the elite level, is early adolescence. But that doesn't mean that we're ignoring the risk. It just means, like as Derek alluded to, we need to have education and maybe some other adjunct programs in place so that they can tolerate those stressors better. And then team sports like tennis and golf, middle adolescence. So maybe I don't know where it categorizes where that actually is. Maybe that's in that 13, 14, 15-year-old range, something like that. And then endurance sports, track, distance events, which made sense to me, like very cyclical loading. The recommended stage of specialization was late adolescence. So perhaps when the body's a little bit more mature and can handle those cyclical stressors a little bit better. What's jumping out at here on Myers 2?
I think one point that I always bring up is there's a stat in here that says 44% of school administrators in the United States report having cut significant time in physical education and recess to increase time for reading and math. And I think we need to step back for a second and also realize we're looking at this through, if we're all sports therapists, we just assume that all of the youth play sports. And that's not necessarily the case. There was a study earlier this year that looked at just overall physical activity that showed that your average American 16-year-old is only as active as your average American 60-year-old these days. And so we definitely have some more sedentary factors to it in general. But I think a lot of times looking at physical education, math, and reading as its own distinct entities, you really lose sight of it, because I guarantee you every weightlifter around can multiply by 90 better than any human. Like, what is most of training in general? A lot of it's percentages. So you start learning that as a skill related to what you're doing, and it gives you context. Like, no one wants to sit there and, learn math, learn fractions. But if that fraction then helps you calculate your training program, then you start tying math into training. And a lot of it is being able to give context. And I think that's what's sorely missing from athletic specialization, is the inability to really have context as an athlete. Like, if we talk all the time about setting up the most ideal environment, but if we only give one environment for an athlete to work in, how are they ever going to have perspective of looking anywhere else? And some of it comes into our perspective as well. It's really funny that we look at humeral head retroversion in baseball players and we say, this is a good thing. This is an adaptive process that helps you as a pitcher. But then let's look at ice hockey, where you see this massively high base rate of hip labral pathology in the asymptomatic athlete. We call that bad. They're both adaptations to sport. It's just we assign context to them